So notice the title says Economic Troubles on the Horizon. So what signs of a faltering economy could people look at that time, even in the midst of the roaring 20s, even in the midst of unprecedented economic growth, wage increases generally, better technology, better quality of life, and we even looked at arts and culture because more people had time to enjoy those things. So what is it that causes a depression? Well, first, we have to look at key industries. Some politicians call these the industries that are too big to fail. Things like, today, the automakers or some large banks, that if these things fail, then our economy could possibly collapse. So what key industries were there in the 1920s? Number one, railroads. The transportation infrastructure of our country. If transportation, which was run privately at this time, collapsed, we're going to experience major layoffs. Those industries purchase lots of materials. They create lots of jobs. Lots of other industries rely on the railroads. Same with textiles. Same with steel. Unfortunately, these industries were barely making a profit at that time. Other key industries, mining, not only coal, but raw materials, iron ore, precious metals. Mining in general was experiencing a decline. The lumber industry was experiencing a slower demand. Part of this was due to a decrease in new home construction as a result of key industries. By key industries, I mean the chief employers in our country, the chief purchasers of materials, the chief creators of jobs. When these industries are experiencing hard times, then people are either being laid off or seeing a reduction in hours, and we measure that generally by looking at a lessening of discretionary income. Coal was especially hard hit. New technologies can create troubles in an economy. Now, this is what we call a time of economic readjustment. For example, the new technology of hydroelectric power was proving cost effective. Dams can generate electricity, and it's a renewable form of energy, as opposed to coal, where there is a finite amount of coal, and when we run out of coal, no more electricity. And so, since there were new forms of energy being discovered, coal's demand was declining. Yet again, coal is a big employer in many areas, particularly in the mountains, in West Virginia, in eastern Kentucky, even parts of Carolina. The coal industry is big. It's a big employer. And so when the demand goes down, people get laid off, people see a reduction in hours. And again, we can measure that nationwide by looking at the amount of discretionary income. Now, the next piece of an economy that we need to look at are called boom industries. Boom industries are the types of industries that rely on a strong economy. This is the consumer industry, where automobiles, home construction, retail, and consumer items, those are big employers. In fact, you may find yourself working for one of these industries this summer. Consumer industries rely on people to have money to buy things. And that money has to come from a strong economy that's creating jobs, that is creating good enough jobs where people have discretionary income to choose to buy things they want. And the trouble with this is when these do poorly, these do poorly. And as a result of this, things like housing, things like automobile construction, sales and retail begin to decline. Now, an economy of a nation is very complicated. So far, we've reviewed what happens when key industries begin to decline. Had it just been that, perhaps we would not have gone to a Great Depression. But also, the end of the First World War caused a decreased demand for U.S. agricultural products. Nations like Britain and France were no longer relying on agricultural products produced in the United States. And since demand fell and the prices of crops went down, the income of the average American farmer was declining. Now, the trouble with this, especially in the 1920s, is we were still a rural agrarian country. Now, we had already gone through our Industrial Revolution. 40% of Americans were living in urban areas, but a large portion of our country was still living in rural agrarian areas, and many of these Americans were relying on farming as their means of income. And when the price of crops went down, many farmers defaulted on their loans. Many lost their farms entirely. The Wizard of Oz was set during this time. Dorothy's family was about to lose her farm to the bank. They simply could not make enough money. Now, what do you do if you're a desperate farmer and the price of crops has fallen? Your only option is to increase your output to hopefully offset the loss of revenue. This is a dangerous game to play, because when farmers begin to grow more crops and the price of crops are going down, all they're doing is increasing the supply of a product in low demand. And when a supply of a product in low demand continues to grow, the price continues to plummet, and the problem becomes worse. Now, banks at this time were not guaranteed by the Federal Reserve. Laws such as the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, laws protecting banks are going to come after. So the trouble with this is banks who relied on investments to farmers, when farmers began to default on these loans, the banks began to fail. This is where things begin to get scary. Now, in the next couple days, today and tomorrow, we'll be looking at how a conservative government responds to an economic crisis like this. Calvin Coolidge, for example, very conservative president, pro-business. He was even the one who said the business of America is business. The government was offering to buy, at least Congress was proposing buying surplus crops from farmers. This would have ensured a small degree of demand. In fact, some proposed in Congress even guaranteeing prices, meaning freezing prices on crops to keep them from falling further. The president actually vetoed what was called the price support bill. And next, since wages in many industries were stagnant, since many people were experiencing layoffs, and also due to increasing credit card debt, which perhaps you remember from the poverty simulation, it can be difficult if you find yourself with a reduced income or a substandard job with a family. It can be difficult to make it through a month without having to borrow money. And so since debt was increasing, our general amount of discretionary income was declining, people have less money to spend. Then much of our economy is based on consumerism. I mean, think about how many products that you buy because you want them. And those companies rely on you buying those products because you want them. And if no one buys those products, they go under. I mean, think about Pepsi. You could live without Pepsi. It tastes good. It's great. You could survive without it. And that could be something if you found yourself without money or a job. You might have to cut Pepsi out of your life. It wouldn't be ideal, but you would survive, and Pepsi would collapse. The scary thing about this is, there's several different recipes, ingredients that go into making a Great Depression. Your key industry is in trouble, the agricultural sector is in decline, discretionary spending on consumer items was going down because of this, and then finally the amount of consumer debt was growing. Many people were having to buy goods on credit. One of your key terms here, of course, that's the simple one, meaning buy now, pay later. The fact that interest rates were low, that businesses were offering easy credit. You could call this even predatory loaning. predatory lending, that is, where businesses were encouraging you to go into debt to get their products, encouraging people to buy things that they could barely afford to make the payments. And so if you find yourself in this situation, you can barely afford to make the payments. What happens if you get laid off? You know, my wife and I are careful with our money, but even still, if one of us got laid off, we might lose our home. We can't default on her student loans. By law, you cannot declare bankruptcy and avoid student loan repayments. We'd have to make those. So we might have to default on our home loan. We do that, we lose our house. The bank sells our home on a short sale. They lose money on the investment, but they would at least get some of it back. So if they have to default on everyone's homes, they could go bankrupt. And that's what was happening in many cases. So people were piling up debt, not just out of greed, not entirely based on stupid decisions, but the amount of consumer debt was growing. And this is scary. Now, when debt increases in your personal life, you have less money to spend on things you want. You have to spend more of your income towards debt repayment. Been there. You know, I know that story too well. And the same goes for national debt. And hopefully you'll learn to manage that responsibly before you acquire a lot of debt. The point is that people find themselves in this situation. And when consumer debt is on the rise, discretionary spending is on the decline generally. Next, we find that much of the Roaring '20s was only roaring for certain groups of people. That is the common phrase you've heard, the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. So much of the gross domestic product increase that we saw was for the very wealthy. In fact, 70% of families, even before the Great Depression, were living below the poverty level. So almost a little over 2 out of every 3 Americans earned less than a minimum for a decent standard of living. And so many of these new products that came out simply were not available. You know, we heard about electricity in homes, modern appliances. At this time in the 1920s, my grandmother was young. They were subsistence farmers. They grew everything they needed.
How did the rich get richer?
Good question. So, what that means is, you know, the old phrase of the rich got richer, the poor got poorer. We're talking about an income gap, a gap between, you know, you may have heard of the phrase 1% and the 99%. So many of the economic gains, many of the raises that were being experienced throughout the 1920s were happening to the rich more than the poor. CEOs were giving themselves giant bonuses and huge pay increases while they weren't giving their employees much of anything. So the point is that if a company experiences greater profits, they are not always going to pass down those profits to their employees. If they don't have to, they might not. They probably won't. It depends on the company. And so this is where we get the income gap, is that a company like Standard Oil, owned by John D. Rockefeller, who owned 90% of the oil in the country, well, how do you think that guy got to own 90% of the oil in the country? He paid his workers very poorly. He invested his profits into acquiring more oil companies through hostile takeovers and mergers, and he didn't pass down the profits to his employees. He kept the profits for himself, and he invested the lion's share back into his company, creating more jobs, but paying his workers substandard rates. Therefore, he became the richest man who ever lived, but his workers were barely making an end. And that was perfectly legal at the time. In fact, you could argue the same is being practiced today. The rich got richer, the poor got poorer. So, an extreme, uneven distribution of income is a sign of a very troubled economy. Now, right before the Great Depression, Herbert Hoover, former president of the Food Administration during the First World War, ran for president. Once he won the primary and became the Republican candidate for president, he won with an overwhelming majority. You see, these signs of a troubled economy, you can see them if you look. But it's not as simple as just watching the television or, at that time, listening to the radio or even reading the newspaper. It takes looking carefully. You know, it might take reading the Wall Street Journal. It might take, well, in our age, simply doing a little Google research on how is the economy really doing. It's not as simple as just, oh, that president is so-and-so, therefore the economy sucks. It's more complicated than that. But nonetheless, Calvin Coolidge oversaw the Roaring '20s, the unprecedented economic growth at the time. People were generally happy with the Republican Party because they were the party that got to live through the Roaring '20s. And so Hoover was elected in a landslide victory. However, there were signs of a troubled economy. One of these is if we look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The Dow Jones Industrial Average tracks the state of the stock market. Now, a stock is a piece of a company. It's a piece of a company that has gone corporate and is traded publicly on the stock market. So, if one of you, let's say one of you starts a cosmetic business. Well, that's really simple. All you need is a place to cut hair and do cosmetics. It's not that complicated. I mean, you need to know what you're doing, obviously. So you might want to take some classes on cosmetics, but when you're ready, you approach the bank, and the bank will give you a small business loan for a storefront. Put your name on the store, get some permits. Congratulations, you're a business owner. You're not part of the stock market yet, though. You only become a part of the stock market when your company has become successful enough to incorporate and then to go public, meaning that you've made enough money where you are prepared to trade shares of your business on the stock market. And that can go very well for you if you're a successful business. And so the Dow Jones tracks the health of companies that are trading shares publicly. Now, you can get investors, even on the small end of having your little cosmetology business. You can seek investors. You could come to someone you know who has a lot of money and say, would you like to be an investor in my company? They give you an investment. They are buying a portion of your company, and they are entitled to dividends, which is a portion of your profits. But you're not there yet. You're not being traded publicly. But when you are, that's a sign that you've made it. Twitter only went public about 2 years ago, if that tells you anything. So we're looking at the successful, the Walmarts, the Amazons, etc. And so the Dow Jones is tracking the health of these stocks, of these shares, these pieces of these large companies. Now, throughout the 1920s, stocks were rising steadily. That meant that the Walmarts, the Amazons, the Standard Oils, they were growing. They were experiencing significant amounts of growth. And this was a good time to invest in the stock market. So that meant that if you bought shares in Standard Oil or Carnegie Steel or F.W. Woolworths, then those companies were doing well. They were experiencing great profits. You would probably see an increase in the value of those stocks. And after you saw that for long enough, and you have half a brain and some money to invest, it's almost like a sure thing. It's like you buy the stocks, you get dividend checks, and you see the value of your stocks grow exponentially. And this encourages people to go into the stock market. And in fact, stocks were rising so rapidly that many people started to even borrow money to buy stock. That's a scary prospect. It's called buying on a margin. And yes, you can do that. You can borrow money to buy stock. Now, banks engage in this practice. This practice was outlawed through Glass-Steagall. It was a federal law that prohibits banks from engaging in speculative investments. But it was done away with in the 90s, and banks are back to doing it. In fact, that's up for discussion. Some of the candidates are proposing a renewed Glass-Steagall. Anyway, speculation and buying on a margin are pretty scary things. Speculation means you're buying stocks on the hope of a quick profit. People do this for a living. They're called day traders. You can make an income. You can make a good living by watching the stock markets closely and by buying and selling shares quickly. It's a dangerous game, but people are involved in that. It's called speculation. Banks do this all the time. So let's say that one of you wanted to buy a house, and you're kind of sketchy. Your job history is not very reliable. Your grades in school were not very good. You don't have a strong history of being a reliable person. So the bank's going to give you a loan. They're going to say, you know what, we're going to loan you the money you need. We're going to charge you a higher interest rate than we would someone who's more reliable. That's called a subprime loan. That means they are engaging, they are giving you a loan, but they're not real sure about you. So because they're not real sure about you, they're going to charge you a higher interest rate. Subprime loans were one of the biggest causes of the '08 recession and were one of the underlying causes of the Great Depression. My point is, it's a house of cards. It's scary. All of these factors that we just discussed are some of the underlying bigger causes of the Great Depression. It wasn't just Black Tuesday. It was all the things that came before. Now, Black Tuesday was September of 1929, when the stock prices finally reached their peak and then began to fall. What economists also look for is signs of a bubble. Research has been done in looking at cities, literally in tracking the size of skyscrapers in looking for bubbles. Is that when companies are growing too quickly and the shares of their stocks are going up too rapidly, that's a sign of what we call a bubble. Now, like any bubble, bubbles can burst. And the bubble burst for the entire stock market here in 1929. It was called Black Tuesday, where the stocks began to plummet. And people watched this closely. And people saw that the value of their stocks were going down dramatically. And again, stocks represent pieces of businesses. And that means that American businesses were declining rapidly for all the reasons we just looked at. And so what do you do as a stockholder? Well, you've got a couple options. If you have other assets, meaning that your financial well-being for the next 10 years is not dependent on the value of those stocks, you can hold on to them. That's called riding out the crash, meaning you don't sell anything. And you'll see an example of this in a clip in just a moment. Your other option is you can try to sell. Try to recoup your losses as quickly as can by selling off as much of the stock as you're able. You know, if I found out one of your businesses was about to go under, but I heard about it or I had a feeling about it before it was going to go under, then I'm going to sell my stock to another one of you. And then I can walk away.
Did any businesses buy out like the other shares that people sold and profit from it?
The Kennedy family is one of the most famous. Joseph Kennedy, the patriarch of the family, not only rode out the Great Depression, he was able to buy up large amounts of stock. And then they became the Kennedy family. But the thing that you get, before you can do that sort of thing, you have to already have enough wealth, as I said, to be able to ride out a depression like this and hold on to those stocks which are virtually worthless, expecting them to rebound. For example, when you go into a job and you get a job with retirement benefits, that's the end goal. You want a job with retirement. Most of your retirements will be based in some part on the stock market. I get a yearly statement from my 401k. It's the retirement. So I'm looking at retiring when I'm in my early 50s. I won't have to teach anymore. I'll do something else, I don't know what. But I'll do something. But I'll be done with teaching. I get a statement every year saying, here's how the stock market's doing. Here's how your retirement's doing. It's either up, it's down, sometimes it's really up, sometimes it's way, way down. I throw it away. I don't even read it. I don't want to know. Because if I watched it closely and I saw it was going down this month, then I might panic and sell. But since I can live without that money until I'm in my 50s, well then I'm not going to touch it. But you see, the trouble is, what does it represent? Now, since all of the stocks were plummeting, that represents all of the businesses for the reasons that we've looked at. And when people tried to sell frantically, many people didn't even want to buy them. That means businesses didn't have the money to continue. They would close their doors. Some people lost everything. And so the stock market crash, known as Black Tuesday, led to the Great Depression, a time when the economy plummeted. Unemployment skyrocketed. It reached the highest level it has yet in our history. It lasted for 11 years. Recessions can last as short a term as 6 months, as long a term as a year. Depressions, we define those as lasting much longer. After this crash, many people panicked. Many tried to take all their money out of the banks. Another word for bank is a trust. In fact, banks are called trust at the larger level. And it relies on a faith relationship between the customer and the bank. You are placing your faith in a bank when you put your money in there, that they will facilitate all your daily transactions. And they do so for free. And we'll learn a little more about that with our next clip. You see, what do banks do with your money? They don't hold on to it. They invest it. They invest it into loans. They invest it into the stock market. And when the stock market failed, many banks began to close. And so many people freaked out, understandably so, and went to the banks and said, I want my money before you close, before it's gone. And so people rushed the banks. During this time, the gross national product, that is the output of our country, the total profits that our country makes, fell by half. Half. Means businesses closed, key industries laid off, tons and tons of workers had to reduce their output, and our entire country's output was reduced by half. 1 out of 4 of Americans were out of work. This peaked at 1 out of every 3 Americans out of work, and it's worse than that. Many of those who had jobs were underemployed, meaning severe reduction in hours and pay. As jobs began to bounce back, many of those were not very good. In fact, that's one of the troubles we've had with our own recovery, is that yes, employment has grown and has begun to bounce back, but the trouble with underemployment is the same trouble they had at that time. Yes?
For the businesses that survived, were a lot of them did a lot of them stay with their original owners, or did a lot of them end up changing ownership because of the crash?
Well, it depends, and in fact, the next clip is a great illustration of that. Many of those folks who had money to invest could buy up these businesses at the lowest prices ever, and with that, they could acquire, large empires very cheaply. It's a sad reality. Is that yes? I mean, with the uneven distribution of wealth, that means there are very few people that have enormous sums of money. And what are they going to do with that money? Well, they want to increase that money. They want to invest. And this is the best time to buy in the stock market when prices are low. And so like he said, this is a good time to buy. And yes, businesses did change hands often. You see, the financial collapse was felt worldwide. What happens in our country affects the rest of the world. The Great Depression limited the United States' ability to import goods from other countries. Countries rely on international trade, and so this affected the economy, particularly of Europe. We also passed the highest protective tariff in American history, called the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act. And this was to restrict trade with other countries so that Americans would be forced to buy American-made products, so getting Americans back to work. The trouble with this is it spread the Depression and made it worse. Other countries couldn't afford to buy American goods, and so since we weren't buying their goods, they couldn't afford to buy our goods. And this led to increasing unemployment around the world. So just by way of review, the general causes of Great Depression: one, trouble with international trade, partly caused by tariffs. Debts from the First World War. Remember, we spent a ton of money on the First World War. That was another underlying cause of the Great Recession just a few years ago. Problems with the agricultural sector because of the availability of easy credit, high consumer debt, and then finally this income disparity, the fact that much of the economic growth was occurring only at the very top. What did the federal government do at this time? Responded by trying to keep interest rates low so that people would borrow more money. Borrowing more money stimulates the economy. But that was about it. And so we'll look at how the conservative, kind of the Republican response to a depression more tomorrow. So first, let's look at how the Great Depression affected people living in cities. Since larger numbers of Americans were living in cities, first off, unemployment. Unemployment hit 25% right away. Underemployment was a major problem. That means you're working as much as you're able, but you're not able to make enough money to provide for your family. In cities, most people pay rent, especially in downtown areas. Not many people are fortunate enough to own the building they live in. They typically pay rent. But even still, for those who own the dwelling that they stay in, you either can't pay rent or you can't pay your mortgage. Both end in eviction, meaning they lost their homes. Where would people go? There were no government safety nets. We're not at a point where there is unemployment, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps. These things don't exist. Social Security did not even exist at this time. So people had no choice but to find homes where they could, meaning they became homeless, living in shacks called shanty towns. People were reduced to digging through the garbage. As the man in the clip said, you don't know what it's like to have to dig through a garbage bin for food. I hope you don't. And people were reduced to begging. It's a humbling, humiliating experience to go from providing for yourself and the confidence and security that affords to being reduced to beg for a living. With no government safety net, people were required to hope for the kindness of private individuals. Private charities provided some of the only direct relief to those made poor by the Great Depression. Soup kitchens or bread lines funded by private charities could sometimes take all day waiting in a line to receive a meager bowl of soup. Minorities, African Americans, and Latinos often experience higher levels of unemployment and lower pay generally. Here's a picture of a shanty that an individual built simply from scraps. This is actually a pretty nice one. Got a stove, got a roof, got walls, and even a window. Most people were living in cardboard boxes or homeless altogether. Now let's look at depression in rural areas. Much of America was still agrarian by the 1920s, meaning that lived on farms in the country in rural areas. How would folks around here have been affected? Well, if your family were already farmers, and if they didn't owe money on their land and home, and they were able to keep their home, well, they might be able to become subsistence farmers, meaning growing enough to survive. That's how my family made it through the Great Depression. Talk to your folks sometime to see how yours made it through. That's easier said than done. My grandmother told stories of her brothers going off to fish all day at a time sometimes, bringing home the fish, eating the ones they could, storing the ones they couldn't, and then doing the same the next day. Or working odd jobs. My grandpa even tried his hand at mining gold. I found his mine when I was a kid. It was really neat. They tried everything. Mining gold. It wasn't very lucrative, so he went to work in a copper mine in Copper Basin, which is just past Murphy. He tried his hand at lumber, cutting wood for a living, one of the more dangerous occupations. Worked for the TVA, building dams. Worked for anything and everything. And then after the war, the GI Bill allowed him to go back to school, and he became a teacher. But not before he had tried his hand at everything to provide for his family, because there was no safety net. It's make it or don't. Unfortunately, about 400,000 farmers lost their homes due to foreclosure. Not everyone was as lucky as my family to have their property fully paid for. Out west, what we call the bread belt, so many farmers had either been evicted, leaving their land fallow or unplanted, or had exhausted the soil in the land from overproduction. Remember, when the price of crops fell, those who were in farming as a business tried boosting production, ending crop rotation, putting as much soil to use as possible. And the side effect of that was that exhausted land cannot produce anything. And this was happening on such a large scale, coupled with a drought through the 1930s, that farms were turning to deserts during a time known as the Dust Bowl. And we'll look at a clip of this in just a moment. The Dust Bowl was an area all the way from North Dakota down to Texas. Through the Great Plains and one of the drier parts of our country. This area was hardest hit, though it was said that the clouds from the Dust Bowl could be seen as far as the East Coast. We're lucky to live in an area with a large amount of rainfall, but if you've noticed the drought in California, even with our modern technology, parts of California have been returned to desert. At a few images of the Dust Bowl here. See the area most heavily affected. By the way, this would be a good example of a photo essay where we're looking at pictures. You could put some music to it too, but you would still need to narrate. Here we're looking at dried up farms. You're looking at irrigation practices. Here you see a dust cloud. Maybe this one's moving a little too fast because I don't have time to discuss all of it. But, you see farmers using various techniques. This would be like subjects of Steinbeck's novel. Many people just simply had to leave their homes. We'll talk about Roosevelt later and his efforts to help overcome the Depression. But take a look at this. You see the Dust Bowl has even buried homes, and here in this case a tractor. So people were calling this a natural disaster at one of the worst times possible. Of course, you see it affected everyone. Now, John Steinbeck wrote his famous Grapes of Wrath, Of Mice and Men, East of Eden. All of these books of his were written about families, individuals. You see, America is not just the story of these powerful white people. It's the story of everyone. And those most severely affected by this depression, by these events, were the average Americans. See here another farm. It looks like they've plowed it recently. To overcome droughts, farmers would attempt various things, but the unfortunate reality is so many lost their farms entirely. So next, I wanted to show you just one more photograph of the effects of this. You see that the sand has piled up. What was once a farm is now a desert, and that home is in the process of being buried. Now, how did this affect the average American family? So for most, a family is a source of strength. Now I have to generalize here, because I can't just say that all Americans are heroes, all Americans endured hardship, and all became better people as a result, because that's not true. Sadly, there were many stories of husbands leaving their homes, family members committing suicide, breaking apart under the strain, children leaving because there's simply not enough food to go around, and people being forced to accept the charity of others. Making ends meet can be a great source of stress. You see, we have this culture. Hoover called it rugged individualism. We pride ourselves on our work ethic. We learn the value of hard work from a very young age, and we extol that virtue. And self-sufficiency is something we strive for. And we even look down on those who are too lazy to help themselves. However, it's a different matter when you take a generation of people who believe in those virtues, who are unable to provide for their family, trying everything possible, like my grandpa, like I'm sure your ancestors tried everything possible to make money to simply put the food on the table. And then imagine you find yourself in that position. How stressful that would be. It's a humbling thing to have to ask for help, to say, I can't do it on my own. Many people weren't willing. Some people, in fact, left their families because they were too prideful to be reduced to begging. About 300,000 mostly young men took to the rails, became hobos, traveled for a living. There was no federal system of direct relief. Today, if one of your parents were laid off, they could at least count on unemployment for a period of time. They could at least hope for some type of relief, Social Security. You could at least apply for health care so you know that if you get sick, it'll be taken care of. There are programs to help you when these things happen. Of course, the intention of these programs is they are meant to be temporary. But at this time, there were no programs. There was no system of direct relief. And so now I want to look at this photograph. Another example of your photo essay. You've got two young men here. I don't know their names. I don't know where this photograph was taken. But we can learn a lot simply by looking at a picture. We can see they're young. I would estimate 12 or younger. We can see there are no parents around. We can see they're walking. They've either just gotten off the train or they're about to try to sneak on. It looks like they're carrying a small amount of food, so I would believe they've been doing this for quite some time. I don't know the name of the photographer, the person who took the photo, though I can tell you they were probably employed by the Works Progress Administration. The New Deal created opportunities for journalists, for teachers, for workers of all trades. And they hired photojournalists to travel the country and document the poverty and suffering. And so I imagine someone took a photograph of these two young men. However, that's probably all they got. Because with no federal system of direct relief, these two young men were forced to travel. Now, what would they do? Where would they go? Well, number one, traveling by train is dangerous. Railroads hire people called bulls. It's the job of the bull to kick you off the train and give you a good solid beating if they catch you. And if they see you again, they might do something worse. It's railroad security. Secondly, you've got to travel with people that you wouldn't obviously choose to travel with. Sometimes hobos were in danger from one another. There's a famous case called the Scottsboro case where a young woman was raped on a train, or at least she claimed she was. It resulted in a huge case, and 8 men spent the rest of their lives in jail accused of rape. It's an interesting case because no proof was ever found of anything, and nonetheless these men spent their lives in jail. We don't really know exactly the details, but the point of it is these 8 young men and the 2 women were all traveling together on a train. So even women were sometimes forced to live on the rails. We don't know how long these young men have been on the rails, but we do know that hobos would develop a system for figuring out where it would be safe to get a warm night's sleep, whose homes would provide them with a meal. But now, if you find yourself in this situation where you suddenly have very little, then you have to budget carefully. You have very limited resources. Many women would sew clothing to attempt to sell it, but also to provide for their families. Many families would grow food and store it. Many canned their own food. Many women went to work outside the home, and we're not really talking about a step towards civil rights here or equality. We're talking about necessity. But the point is that there were many people, proud people, who wanted to earn a living for their families, who were unable to because there were not opportunities available. Sadly, hardship affects children most severely. It's important for everyone to have a good nutritional balance and eat well every day. It's especially important for children. Growing and developing, it's not possible without a healthy, balanced diet. Malnutrition can lead to serious health effects, not only in everyone in general, but for children. Did you know that the average height of the average American during this time was much shorter? Did you know the average life expectancy was much lower? Did you know that many schools closed entirely during the Great Depression? With a lack of tax revenue, they had to close their doors. And as I said previously, many children left home entirely. There just wasn't enough food to provide for them. Are part of the natural flow of an economy. This has been evidenced with the burst of the tech bubble in the early 2000s, when the dot-com era came to an end. It could be looked at by seeing the steady incline or steady increase of our economy through the 90s. It could be evidenced by the roaring 20s, by the steady growth of wages, by the steady growth of gross domestic product, and then the decline. And so he, citing economists, would point out this is natural. And he believed, as did the Republican Party, that it was not the purpose of the government to meddle in the economy. In fact, Calvin Coolidge said it well: the business of America is business. That a government exists not to control an economy, but to foster cooperation between competing groups. Meaning, it is private business, privately regulated, free market, unhindered by government regulation. That's conservative economics. That when it comes to the social welfare of the people themselves, the conservatives believe that people should take care of their own families and not be reliant on the government. Classic example, in Mississippi, when they experienced a great flood in the 1920s, a great flood, the equivalent of Katrina, New Orleans underwater, people displaced, homes destroyed. Calvin Coolidge, what did he tell them? Forget it. It is not the government's job. In fact, he said, and I quote, "The government is not an insurance broker to the poor." He believed it was not the government's job to bail them out. And we're going to look at other examples of that related to the Great Depression today. He called it rugged individualism. That you stand or you fall on your own merit. So he took pride in that. And again, this is conservative economic theory still today, that you stand or fall on your own merit. And that's one way of looking at things. So what does this mean practically? So Hoover took very cautious steps in approaching the economic crisis our country was facing. For one, he called a meeting of business and banking and labor leaders to sit down together and discuss and attempt to solve these problems. He believed it was the government's job to facilitate conversation, facilitate community involvement with private entities. He created, in fact, an organization for private groups to raise charitable funds to help people. So he's not looking at this from a cold-hearted perspective saying, "Oh, you're starving, well, that sucks to be you." He's simply saying it is not outlined in the Constitution that the government should take an active role in the social welfare of its own citizens. And to be fair, if you look at the preamble, that's not one of the 6 outlined purposes of our government, according to the preamble. So that's where he's basing that theory. And so he created an organization to foster private cooperation in helping alleviate the suffering of American people. One of his great successes in this facet is Boulder Dam, more popularly known as Hoover Dam. It was named after him because of his enormous success. The amazing thing about this dam, it was the largest dam in the world for its time. Generates a large amount of electricity, holds in reservoir scarce water resources in an arid region, controlling flooding, but also distributing water to a place that would be desert otherwise. There would be no Las Vegas without Hoover Dam. But what's amazing about it is he was able to do this without spending taxpayer dollars. Hoover Dam was built through private investment, and Hoover facilitated that private investment. It created thousands of jobs, generates lots of revenue, and is today still an important control of that precious resource in an arid region. Provides electricity enough to power Las Vegas, provides flood control, and then finally water to places that desperately need it. So the Hoover Dam, one of the great successes.
How many people died during the building of that?
I have no idea how many people died during the building of the dam. I imagine several would have. For example, quite a few folks died in the digging of the Panama Canal, mainly because in a tropical area, malaria is a huge concern. Yellow fever, cholera, things you have to deal with in tropical areas. On the Colorado River where this is built, you're dealing with desert conditions. And that creates its own logistical challenges. Number one, how to get enough potable water to the workers, how to deal with droughts, dust storms, But I don't know, so you may want to look that up and let us know. Hoover Dam is one of those great successes in that he was able to do this through private investment. But unfortunately, that's not enough. The building of the dam created hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs. But that's not enough. We're dealing with 25% of Americans out of work. Those who had jobs were underemployed. And as economic problems increased, people turned against the Republican Party. The party that they had supported through the boom times of the 1920s was now blamed for the economic problems facing our country. The Democrats took control of the House in the midterm elections in 1930. The Republicans managed to hold on to a one-vote majority in the Senate. So enough to prevent a two-thirds supermajority, but not enough to get anything done. And so when you see this type of situation, which is what we have now, where the legislative and the executive are controlled by two different parties, it can result in what's called a lame duck Congress, where nothing gets done. And that's the situation we're in now. Meanwhile, farmers have been beset by falling crop prices. Farmer cooperatives around the nation agreed to create artificial food shortages to raise the price of crops. The irony here that John Steinbeck points out in Grapes of Wrath is that farmers were literally dumping crops into rivers, and guards were posted to keep people from stealing them. And so there were real situations where food was being destroyed while people were starving, which Steinbeck points out is pretty messed up. Meanwhile, people are homeless. 300,000 hobos, millions more have been displaced. And so people started calling their shanty towns Hoovervilles in criticism of the president. There are a few examples of the conservatives taking direct action here. No conservative is purely, only, ever conservative. Same with liberals. There's no purist in these regards. People have to be willing to compromise. Small government people have to be willing to take direct action in some circumstances. So Hoover was able to negotiate agreements among private entities. That was one of his big successes. He supported private organizations like the Federal Farm Board. That was a group of farming collectives. And they agreed to buy up excess crops as a group and to hold them until market prices rose. He was able to get large banks, private large banks, to establish a national credit corporation. That is for large banks to merge, to pool resources, etc. But next, the direct action I was speaking of. Two examples of this are the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which lowered mortgage rates, trying to encourage people to buy new homes to bolster the home construction and real estate market. Also, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This was created to provide emergency funds for businesses, to keep private businesses afloat by providing emergency loans. So these were two examples of direct action taken by the Republican president. The trouble with this, and where people distance themselves from the Republican Party politically, is we're dealing with a crisis, an economic crisis. And what we have to remember is what else is going on around the world, is that this depression is being felt around the world. We're lucky that we're a nation rich in resources. We're lucky that we were a wealthy enough nation to be able to create programs like the New Deal, offering millions of jobs, rebuilding infrastructure. Some countries collapsed. Germany turned to fascism, so did Italy. Russia's experiencing civil wars in its transition to communism. Places around the world are collapsing. In fact, immediately following the Second World War, we would be bailing out a number of countries, including Greece and Turkey, that were on the verge of complete collapse of their economic system. So we're lucky that we're a nation rich in resources. Everyone else was not so lucky. But even though we came out of this okay, that was 11 years after the crash. 11 years of suffering, 11 years of 25% unemployment. So how do we address it? The point that the American public discovered is small government wasn't working. Another tragic example is the story of the Bonus Army. World War I veterans marched on Washington, D.C. in 1932 asking for the President's support of the Patman Bill. The Patman Bill was going to provide immediate payment for bonuses that had been promised to veterans of the First World War. The Republican-controlled Senate voted down the bill that the House had introduced. The President opposed the bill, and so he made it clear it wasn't going to get past his desk. And then he told the veterans to leave. However, about 2,000 stayed, demanding to speak with Hoover himself. The President sent out the U.S. Army to disband the Bonus Army. He sent American troops against aging veterans. Tear gas was fired into the crowd, injuring men, women, and children. I'm going to show you footage of this. Someday when you get to go to D.C., and you stand at the Lincoln Memorial, you'll think about Martin Luther King and his famous I Have a Dream speech. And it's one of those wonderful moments when you get to stand there and think about that. But I want you to also think about all of these other dark times. I want you to think of the Bonus Army and the fact that there was a time in American history where veterans asked our government to treat them with decency, and the President responded by calling troops and shooting tear gas into a peaceful crowd of veteran protesters, demanding fair payment for what had been promised to them. So today I get to introduce you to an amazing person, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was the New York governor and then nominated by the Democratic Party to run for president in 1932. As a reform-minded individual, he convinced America of its need for the public to take an active role in the welfare and concern of its people. The Democrats overwhelmingly won the White House, running against Herbert Hoover, whose failures with the Bonus Army and in combating the Great Depression had caused the public to turn against the Republican Party. The Democrats now have a majority in the Senate, in the House. They now control the executive, and we'll see how they take steps towards gaining control even in the Supreme Court. It's one of the few times in American history where all branches of the government were on the same page, working together to combat a crisis. Now, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was no expert on all things. A good leader surrounds themselves with brilliant individuals who can give good guidance and support. Roosevelt called his cabinet the Brain Trust. Very capable individuals who helped him formulate policies to alleviate problems in the Great Depression. They called the programs the New Deal. The New Deal focused around the 3 R's. And the 3 R's are essential to understanding the economic recovery that we're going to be discussing. Relief, recovery, reform. Everything we'll talk about today falls into one of those 3 categories. Relief for the needy, recovery for the economy, and reform for the financial system. So hopefully these things won't happen again. The first 100 days of a president's term are extremely important. This is when the public is most supportive of what a president hopes to achieve. This is called the honeymoon period, where if a person is going to prove their effectiveness, they have those first 100 days to show what can be done. Roosevelt managed to pass 15 major New Deal laws during this time. It's unheard of. Again, he has the legislature in compliance and in agreement, and that can be rare sometimes. He had a clear mandate, meaning that the people were overwhelmingly in support of he and his party. And so when that happens, you see an overturn in the legislature as well as the executive, meaning that people were voting straight down party ticket, that the Democrats were able to take control of the White House as well as the legislature, allowing for a number of very important laws to be passed. Number one is the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And this permitted the Treasury Department to inspect all American banks, to close the ones that were insolvent, and to bolster and bail out or loan money to the ones that could stay open. This restored public confidence in the banks, allowing people to keep their money in the banks, and it was meant to prevent these rushes on banks that we saw last week.
With the banks that closed down, what happened to the people that had their money in there?
So the government would actually take over those banks, and we'll see more about that in just a second. So, a president must be not just a good decision maker. They must be a good communicator. Even more so today, now that the cameras are on the president and every action he does. But at this time, Roosevelt was able to take advantage of a new technology, radio. And he communicated to the American people on a regular basis through radio. He called it the fireside chats. He would sit with his young niece, and he would explain to her the problems facing our country and how he was going to do his very best to solve them. And so, in explaining complex economic theory to a child, he was helping the American people to grasp what must be done. And so again, a president, a good leader, must be an effective communicator and able to relate difficult information simply. Because of these 15 major New Deal pieces of legislation, they were new. Many of these ideas had never been tried. Many of them represented a significant shift in the way the government functions. For example, the Glass-Steagall Act established the FDIC, or Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And to answer your question, it insures individual bank accounts up to $250,000, still exists today. When you write a check, when you put money in a bank, even if that bank collapses or closes, your account is insured by the federal government. It also regulates banking practices. And the FDIC was created by using a law called the Glass-Steagall Act. And you may have heard of this law being mentioned in the 2016 presidential campaign because some candidates want to bring it back. It was done away with in the 1990s during the bank's period of being deregulated. And you could argue that the deregulations through the 1990s allowed banks to do some sketchy things which caused the 2008 financial crisis. And now some politicians are proposing to pass once again a law that proved so effective through the Great Depression. You see, it insured individual bank accounts. And that part is still with us. Every check you write will have the words FDIC at the bottom. So your accounts are protected. But the second part, the regulating banking practices, I'll get into in a moment.
Do you think that if it was, like, they would change it to adjust for inflation over time?
You mean the amount of money insured?
Yes.
I'm assuming so, yeah. So, I mean, $250,000 is the current amount that your account is insured. It was probably much less at that time. The second part requires a little explanation. You see, regulating banking practices. Today, banks can take your money and play the stock market with it. They can engage in speculative trading, meaning buying some sketchy stocks. And there's not much that can be done about it. They can gamble with your money and get away with it. And that's part of why the Great Recession of 2008 occurred. Banks were gambling with your money. It was called the Subprime Loan Mortgage Crisis. Read more about it later. And we'll talk more about it in here much later. Well, you see, Glass-Steagall outlawed that practice. In fact, it, along with the Federal Securities Act, were hoping to restore public confidence in the banks and in the stock market by making them accountable to regulation. The Federal Securities Act created the Securities and Exchange Commission, a watchdog agency which was meant to regulate the stock market. Something else that Roosevelt did was he ended prohibition. Now, a president doesn't have the authority to overturn the 18th Amendment, which was prohibition. But he was able to a president can introduce legislation to Congress, meaning that he suggested to Congress, and he said, and I quote, "It's time America had a drink." And Congress was like, yeah, let's legalize it, let's tax it, let's generate revenue and create jobs. And so alcohol became legal as a result of the 21st Amendment, requiring a 2/3 vote in Congress in 1933 to repeal the 18th Amendment. So all of those things I just told you, they fall into a category of reform. We have to ensure that a crisis of this scale cannot occur again. Now, we also have the challenge of recovering the economy. And we'll start with the farming sector. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was aimed at helping farmers have profitable businesses once more. In fact, it authorized subsidies of agricultural goods, literally paying farmers to grow less food so that the price of crops would go up and that the supply would go down. This was going to be controversial, and we'll talk about why in just a moment. But the next one was not controversial at all. The Tennessee Valley Authority, in fact, is still around today, and they still provide electricity for a large part of the southeastern United States. And it began as a jobs creation program. They built a number of dams around the southeast, quite a number of the lakes that we have near us, Kiowee, Jocassee, Lake Lure, Lake Summit, Lake Logan. Essentially all the lakes in our region are created by hydroelectric dams. Lake Fontana. In fact, there are only a few naturally occurring lakes in the southeastern United States. Most were created as hydro projects. Not only does this create jobs, because it requires a massive labor force to construct a dam of that scale, but it also provides electricity to rural parts of the region. Next, jobs programs. Still along the lines of economic recovery. The Civilian Conservation Corps was created to put young men to work. They built a number of the roads around here. The Blue Ridge Parkway was built by the CCC. Most of the forest roads in Pisgah, most of the trails that we access on a regular basis were built by the CCC. Roosevelt realized that we had a crumbling infrastructure, that roads needed to be built, bridges needed to be rebuilt in many cases, and that a massive labor force would be required to do these projects. And this would create jobs.
Where's all the money coming?
We'll get that in just a second. So, next is the Public Works Administration. We are talking about the creation of tens of millions of jobs here, which, excellent question, where's the money coming from? And we'll get to that. The Public Works Administration commissioned the creation of sculptures, of fountains, of parks. Mount Rushmore was built during this time as a result of the Public Works Administration, and again aimed at reducing unemployment. The Civil Works Administration, this is to create jobs for civil servants like teachers. In fact, it provided the funds to build new schools and provided the funds to put teachers back to work, to open the schools that had closed. And those items would have fallen under economic recovery. But now back to reform. You see, people accused Roosevelt of being a socialist because he pushed for increased regulation on private business. For example, the National Industrial Recovery Act established codes of fair practice for industries. We learned that one of the underlying causes of the Great Depression was a gap in salary between managers and employees, an income gap between the wealthy and the poor. And so the National Recovery Administration was created to set industry standards for workers, to set maximum prices for certain products so that price gouging did not go on, and that is companies taking advantage of a limited or short-term monopoly on a certain good. And then finally, even limited by federal law production of certain items. We've seen this in wartime where governments take greater control over private industry, and essentially what Roosevelt was doing here with the New Deal was declaring war on the Great Depression. And we spent nearly as much as we did, well, equivalent to what we did in the First World War. But also relief. You see, millions of Americans had lost their homes, their jobs, everything. And many banks were having to foreclose on homes. When a bank has to foreclose on your home, of course you become homeless, and that's awful. But the banks are also losing money on an investment when they foreclose on a home. And so it's advantageous for the banks to not have to foreclose, and it's certainly advantageous for the families who get to keep their homes. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was created to provide emergency federally backed low-interest loans that could be paid back at a later time. The Federal Housing Administration also provided loans for new mortgages or repairs of old existing homes. Perhaps one of the most important relief organizations created during this time is the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. It is now called the Federal Emergency Management Administration, also known as FEMA. And you may have heard of them. Anytime we have a natural disaster, FEMA will go in, and people whose homes have been displaced, they will get them temporary shelter and food and clothing. And so this group does amazing things to help large numbers of people who are affected by crises beyond their control. And this is to provide for the basic needs of people hardest hit by the Depression. Because you may have heard from one of the little clips of Roosevelt's speeches that 1/3 of Americans lacked the basic goods for living, lacked shelter, food, and clothing. And how can someone begin to provide for themselves when they don't have a safe place to sleep? And so we had this relief organization created, which continues to help millions of people. So now to your question, where's this money coming from? If you remember us discussing the First World War and the American Civil War, and essentially any war we've been involved in, we didn't have enough money to pull it off. We had to spend more than what we made. In fact, for the First World War, we had enough to pay for about a third of our cost. We borrowed the rest. We would not have been able to fight the Revolutionary War without loans from France and Spain. And generally, wars have contributed to the national debt more so than any other aspect of public policy. Well, we spent as much on the New Deal as we did on the First World War. We spent roughly $33 billion on the New Deal and about the same on the First World War. And like with the war, we didn't have the money to pay for it. So that means we're going to have to borrow. And when a government is spending more money than what they make in tax revenue, that's called deficit spending. And as you just heard in the clip, there were a number of conservatives who felt strongly opposed to this policy. In fact, there were groups called the Liberty groups. I'll come back to them in just a moment. But number one, conservatives were claiming that this was a step towards socialism, that the government was taking too active a role in the economy. And then, as you saw in the clip, there were liberal critics as well that were saying we need to go a step further and guarantee a base income for all Americans. Well, the Supreme Court got involved. The National Industrial Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act were ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, that the government did not have the right to interfere in business in those ways. So Roosevelt responded by introducing the court packing bill, where he was going to add more Supreme Court justices who were loyal to his perspective, and that would overturn these cases. Now, by 1937, Roosevelt had been in power since 1932. One of the privileges of the president is picking new justices. And so by 1937, 7 justices had retired, and FDR was able to appoint new ones. And this is what gave him the influence to push through what he called the Second New Deal, which we'll look at more tomorrow. But the critics, conservative opponents, formed the American League. They believed that these measures to combat income inequality and create jobs were depriving Americans of their personal property and rights. So the classic conservative critique of liberal economic theory is they call it socialism. And that socialism represents a threat to American freedom. Now, FDR, when you think about it, was a democratic socialist. He was elected democratically, and he was instituting and creating socialist programs. Social Security is a socialist program. These jobs programs were socialist programs. The military, the police, government, education, public education is a social program for the benefit of all that requires taxpayer money. And so really what conservative critics were saying is by taxes going up, that's less money that I'm making with my paycheck. And so their criticism was that's a violation of personal property rights. But again, there were critics on the left. And what we have to understand is there were communist and socialist movements going on all around the world in response to the economic crisis. And there were a number of Americans that wanted us to go fully to the left, to guarantee employment for all. And that is full socialism. Or to guarantee a base income for every American regardless of employment status. Again, so there were some that wanted us to go all the way. Father Charles Coughlin that you heard about wanted the government to take over the banking system entirely. And Roosevelt wasn't prepared to go that far. The Senator Huey Long was one of the more famous critics that hope to implement full socialism in the United States. Now, by 1935, the economy had begun to show signs of recovery. Jobs were being created by the millions. Reform laws had been passed. Relief was being given to those who needed it most. However, the recovery was not as great as the president had been hoping. So this led FDR to launch a second phase, even more relief for the agricultural sector, particularly for workers, for farmers, to allow workers to return to their farms, to help the 400,000 farms that had been foreclosed on to begin to resettle those areas. Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, one of the most famous first ladies in American history. She was very active in social reform. She was very active in politics herself. In fact, when John Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath and schools banned this book around the country, people accused him of being a communist and exaggerating the information. She went herself to California to visit with the migrant workers to verify that what he was saying was accurate. She was well known for using her position to influence for social equality. Now, in 1936, Roosevelt won re-election. And this is an exciting thing. For one, it's as I told you yesterday, one of the few times in American history where all three branches of government were working together. And that takes a united American people. And that's rare because we are commonly a divided nation. We fight amongst ourselves. We divide ourselves over politics, religion, race, class, gender, and we bicker. And sometimes it takes a common foe to unite the American people. And usually, that's war. It's a sad fact that during times of war, the American people tend to unite, at least at its beginning. But this time we united to face an economic crisis, the Great Depression. So the president won. In fact, the Democratic Party won large majorities in both houses. FDR won with an overwhelming majority. This was also the first time that African Americans voted for the Democratic Party. African Americans had been voting Republican since they had been allowed to vote. It was the Republican Party that invaded the South in the Civil War to free slavery. It was the Republican Party that pushed forward the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It had been the Republican Party working to reconstruct our country. And then in 1936, blacks started voting Democrat. In fact, Southern states started voting Republican from 1936 through the 1940s until the present day, where most Southern states vote for Republican candidates exclusively. And that's a social shift that we'll look at through the coming chapters. Labor unions supported the presidential candidate, and FDR was building a diverse coalition. A coalition means a diverse group of people coming together for a common cause. Because you see, there were problems faced by farmers, such as soil depletion from an overproduction of crops, trying to make a living when crops were not selling. Because farms were being foreclosed on, banks were losing everything. Banks were unable to loan money to farmers to buy more land. Many people had lost homes, and in rural areas, squalid housing was common. And that means being forced to live in deplorable conditions. Dust storms facing the Great Plains, massive debts, the fact that banks were forced to foreclose on homes, and then sadly, most rural parts of our country didn't even have electricity. This area would probably not have had electricity in the 1930s. So these are problems faced by all. Now, how is our government going to solve them? In 1936, with the beginning of the New Deal, Roosevelt had to address several laws that had been passed that had been struck down by the Supreme Court. Chief among these was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. The Supreme Court said the government may not pay farmers to not grow crops. That was seen as too much government meddling in the economy. And so the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act was passed. This, instead of paying farmers not to grow food, rewarded farmers for practicing soil conservation. Now, the new Agricultural Adjustment Act was able to get around the unconstitutional part. You can't pay farmers to not grow crops. You can't pay farmers to destroy crops. Steinbeck writes in Grapes of Wrath about farmers dumping crops into the river to destroy them, and armed guards keeping the homeless from grabbing them. Now, the Resettlement Administration provided opportunities for small farmers to buy more land or displaced farmers to buy their homes back. There were many farmers out there who were renting the land, like the sharecroppers we talked about in chapter 12. And the Farm Security Administration provided low-cost loans so that people could buy the land they had been renting. Now, the Farm Security Administration also hired photographers and artists and performers to travel the country. And so it, again, created jobs, but the main purpose of this was focusing on the farming sector to try to bolster our food production economy, but also to help millions of Americans who had been displaced because of these things. But you see, many of these problems were faced by all Americans, such as the problem of unemployment. If you find yourself unemployed and unable to provide for yourself and your family, then obviously you found yourself in a position of poverty. Now, with poverty comes hopelessness. Being unable to provide for yourself and having to ask for help is indignifying, meaning it's humiliating. We want to be independent. You should want to earn what you get. That's the work ethic we're taught from birth. Imagine how hopeless it is to be in a position where you want to work, you are able to work, but you can't find work. And this was a common problem in the Great Depression. And of course, there's the practical problem. If you can't work, you don't have any money. And there was no social safety net at this time. So you either found work or you became desperate. And as we talked about in chapter 22, the suicide rate went up. The number of people leaving homes because they just couldn't have another mouth to feed. It was all too common. Men and women had to sit in bread lines all day simply to wait for a bowl of soup.
During this time, because of the poverty, what did banks do with the foreclosed homes? Did they try to wait to sell them?
Good question. So, foreclosures. When a foreclosure happens, the worst part is obviously that the family loses their home. But the bank is also losing money on an investment. So when a bank loans you money to buy a home, they're loaning you that money and receiving it back with interest. So on a solid loan, they're expecting to make, 12, 15% on their return. Now, it's a long-term investment, so they make many of these investments, but it relies on your ability to pay back the home with interest. If you foreclose, meaning if the bank has to come and take your home, what they'll often do is try to sell the home to regain their losses. These are called short sales. The bank needs to liquefy that asset so that they can free up those funds to make better investments in the future. And so what they will do typically is sell the home at a small loss, trying to recoup their losses. Now, during the Depression, what you were mentioning is if you're in a position where you can't sell that home, well, then the bank is losing money because that's an asset they're holding on to that can't be liquidated. So they have the choice. Either they can sell it for an extremely low price or they can try to ride it out. And just like any investment, that would depend on the wealth of the investor. And that would depend on how financially solvent that particular bank was. Depending on could they ride it out. Joe Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's dad, was able to ride out the Depression by buying up cheap stocks. Very same philosophy. So instead of selling, he was buying. He was buying up these cheap stocks that desperate companies and banks were attempting to liquefy. And they were all too willing to sell them at a very cheap price. So if you ever find yourself in an investment possibility, buy during a weak time in the economy because you can buy stocks cheaper. But of course that requires the hope that the economy will bounce back. Yeah.
If you go bankrupt, are stocks like property that can be used to try to repay your debts?
So if you go bankrupt, all of your assets are liquidated and taken possession of by the bank. So all of your assets, anything worth money, would be taken over by the bank. It's not a good situation to find yourself in. I mean, bankrupt literally means you are left with nothing, but all of your debt is forgiven. It's a bad situation for the bank because you probably don't have enough assets to equal the value of your loan. And so they will lose money on you. And so it's advantageous to the bank to not foreclose on people.
If you did have enough money to repay the debt, would they take more than what they originally had, or would they take what?
You mean if you have enough in your assets to repay the debt?
Yeah.
That's called collateral, and the bank would take the value of that. If you have enough collateral to pay off the value of your debt, then you're square. You're good. You wouldn't have to declare bankruptcy. So if you had assets exceeding the level of your debt, it would not make sense to declare bankruptcy. Yes?
Is that like in the case of like Donald Trump?
Where his
Because like
now,
he started many businesses and then just like filed bankruptcy.
and this is a confusing thing too. An individual may file for bankruptcy once during their life. Businesses may also file for bankruptcy, and there are different rules relating to businesses. So the question is how to fix these things. And for those who are unemployed and those who owe money, well, if you're renting an apartment in a city and you lose your job, you can't keep your apartment. Suddenly you're homeless. If you are living in the country and you lose your job, you don't have a means of income, but you own the land that you live on, you could become a subsistence farmer. It depends on the situation. My family became subsistence farmers. Hunted, fished, grew crops, literally for survival, and then found odd jobs to make ends meet so they could buy certain things. But that's a desperate situation. Now, again, if you live in the city, you may not even have that luxury, so become homeless. So the Works Progress Administration was the most ambitious jobs program yet. It created 8 million jobs. Literally anything. Roosevelt even said, I'll pay workers to dig a hole and then pay people behind them to fill it in, just so that people can have the dignity of working and earning their income. The WPA workers built everything from airports to roads to public buildings, employed people to sew clothing for the needy, employed writers, employed artists, employed performers, literally anybody and anybody to do anything. This is called improving the infrastructure of our country. Positive things. People have contract ideas. They can go to the government and they can begin working on them. The government can employ people in building roads. The Blue Ridge Parkway was created by groups like this during the Great Depression. The National Youth Administration was created particularly for young people, so they could get jobs while they were in school, so that they could go back to getting an education. And in many cases, deals were made with students where they could work in exchange for their education. It was called work-study programs. Now, on to reform. The goal of the New Deal was so that we would not find ourselves in a Great Depression ever again. And many of the lessons that we learned from the Great Depression were applied to prevent the 2008 financial crisis from turning into another Great Depression, because it nearly was. So the National Industrial Recovery Act was struck down by the Supreme Court as unconstitutional. It was said that, it was too much government meddling in private enterprise, because it allowed the government to set maximum prices to control free trade. That was struck down as unconstitutional, and it was reintroduced as the National Labor Relations Act, more popularly known as the Wagner Act. This protects rights of workers to join unions. Under the Wagner Act, you have the right to unionize in any job that you work in. Some jobs will ask you to sign what's called a yellow dog contract, meaning that you voluntarily agree not to join a union if you are employed at that place. But the Wagner Act protects your right to join a union. Also protects your right to collective bargaining. Collective bargaining means that if one of you experienced injustice, but no one else felt the same way you did, you might complain. However, it's not going to be that effective, because only one of you noticed an injustice. But if you join together, if you convince other people that this injustice needed to be fixed, and you could get people to work together with you towards a common goal, that's called collective bargaining. Like the old United Farm Workers used to say, united we stand, divided we fall. It also prohibited unfair labor practices. It set maximum work hours. To be fair, that was the Fair Labor Standards Act. This created the minimum wage. Many of you will be working this summer, perhaps your first job, and it will probably pay you minimum wage. And that is by federal law the lowest a company is legally allowed to pay you. And you are entitled to what's not yet considered a living wage, but at least a minimum wage.
If you're under 18, can they pay you less than that, or is it still apply?
It still applies. So federal minimum wage applies across the board. Of course, you may have heard of many of the injustices and loopholes that people take advantage of, exploiting illegal workers for lower pay. But it can at least be held accountable to in regards to publicly disclosed salaries.
It was a question, but I realized I answered.
So how do they handle like salaries with that?
Salaried positions.
That isn't based off like the hours.
Yeah, so salaried positions tend to be better than minimum wage. But even still, they're based on a contract for how many hours you're going to be working. So I am contracted for 40 hours per week, though the expectation is I often put in far more than that. And that's just part of the understanding. But my salary is much better than minimum wage, so I agreed to that understanding that I may have to work overtime occasionally and quite often. But yeah, so minimum wage means in an hourly position, you are paid by law a federal minimum. And of course, follow the election closely, because that's under discussion right now. Some candidates propose a higher minimum wage. Some propose removing minimum wage. So you just need to watch closely.
Right now it's $7.25, and that's like, I don't think they should remove it, because when you're hired as a teenager, you're expecting to get it.
Yes. So
If you have to like say the wage that you want, that can turn employers off.
Yeah, a minimum wage. It's an interesting debate, and we'll do a debate on minimum wage coming up soon. But the bottom line is that you know that you can get a job and be paid at least this minimum. And some candidates are arguing that that minimum wage should be what's called a living wage. That if you work a full-time job, 40 hours a week, you should be able to not have to live on food stamps. And that's the push for the living wage. Yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, is minimum wage determined by state government or national?
States may choose to raise it above the federal minimum, but the federal minimum is currently $7.25.
That's what it is for North
Yeah.
Carolina.
Yeah.
I think Connecticut, they made it $10 an hour.
Yeah, LA is experimenting with 12. Oregon, I think Seattle tried 15. So, yeah, it's being tried in different places. But the movement for a living wage means that you should be able to. Some believe that individuals should be able to work full time and not have to live on food stamps or welfare. They should be able to provide for themselves and their family. Yeah, Brian.
Do you know what candidates don't want any minimum wage offhand?
Some of the GOP candidates I've heard calling minimum wage.
I mean, I figured it was, like, I just didn't know which, like, do you know specifically?
I'd have to look it up, but I have heard some of them call it. They've called it some very bad things. I don't remember exactly, but it's typically the conservative critique of this is it represents too much government control over private enterprise. Yes.
So would it actually help to raise minimum wage? Because then when the higher jobs, they'd have to make their pay higher because people would have to be more qualified that. So then the jobs above that would get paid higher, and then everything gets more expensive. Like, would that happen, or would?
Yeah, and that's another critique of minimum wage is that it contributes to inflation, meaning that if everyone gets paid more, then everyone will spend more, and prices of goods will go up, and that value actually goes down. I guess the other side. So on one side, people say it contributes to inflation. On the other, people say it hasn't kept up with inflation. So, for example, in most salaried positions, you get what's called a cost of living adjustment raise, meaning that money in 2008, when I started in North Carolina, was worth more than it is in 2016. That's just a fact of life, inflation. So to get a cost of living adjustment raise, that's not actually a raise, that's just saying, here's what you made in spendability in real dollars in 2008. We're going to try to match that because money is worth less than in what it was. And so the argument made is that as cost of living has gone up, minimum wage has not kept up with the rising cost of living. So minimum wage, while it's $7.25, in actual spending dollars, that's far less than what it was when $7.25 was raised. Does that make sense? So the spending power goes down without that cost of living adjustment. Yeah.
When it's made to be, or if and when it's made to be the cost of living instead of minimum wage, how is that going to affect like teenagers who do work, but I don't have to pay my cost of living?
Well, yeah, by cost of living, what I'm saying is the price of everything is going up. Whether it's your clothes, your cell phone bill.
They're making the minimum wage the living wage.
Right.
If they do that, will there be new rules?
So if the federal minimum is set at, say, 15, some propose 12, some 15, some smaller raises, it would be the federal minimum for teenagers, for adults, for anyone. Now, that's a big economic issue in this election. And it's something that you need to think carefully about as you're deciding who to support. And be aware that some candidates want to remove minimum wage. Some candidates want to keep it the same. Some candidates... Social Security is one of the most lasting programs of the New Deal. It was the first social safety net. The first social safety net. In 1935, the Social Security Act created the Social Security system. It provided old age insurance for those who were aged 65 or older, unemployment compensation, as well as aid to disabled families or disabled or families with children. So Social Security was not meant to be an alternate income for those who are disabled or those who are unable to work. It was called a social safety net. A safety net means that if unfortunate things happen, you are not going to starve to death, that you're not going to lose your home, that there are programs that can provide help. Now, this is still around today. When you turn 65, hopefully it will still be around by the time you turn 65, and you will be eligible for benefits. When you start working, you'll begin to receive statements from the Social Security Administration every year saying, at your current level of employment and income, here's what your retirement will be. And even mine right now is not that good. It says very clearly, you're not going to make it on Social Security by yourself. You need to also have other forms of retirement. But it is a form of retirement. So it is a piece of what will become your retirement.
What are the two sides for that, like politically?
The two sides for that? Some suggest, and there's a whole debate we'll do on Social Security later too. We'll get into current events issues soon, towards the end of the course. One side suggests raising the age requirement, saying you have to be 75. So some would say we need to reduce benefits. Some say we need to make Social Security solvent, and there are plans in place. So I guess the two sides of the aisle, the extreme conservative side would say allow Social Security to fail, or at the very least reduce its benefits by raising the age requirement significantly. Yeah.
What would happen to like our money basically if it doesn't that gets shut down?
Well, so currently what's happening is our population is getting older, and people are living longer, and so the number of elderly is exceeding the number of people paying into this system. And the concern with that being is that if the number of contributions does not go up, meaning if we don't start taxing the wealthy more, basically, then they will have to reduce benefits. And the simplest proposal for that so far would say instead of getting your Social Security at 65, you would have to wait until you're 75. Yeah.
They don't actually start taking Social Security out of your pay until you turn 18. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that.
Sorry, I have to do
Yeah,
that
no, it's okay.
now.
Yeah, you'll notice three things, and I need to move on, but you'll notice three things taken out of your check each week or month or whenever it is you're paid. The biggest will be your federal income tax, and then Social Security and Medicare. And I forgot in our state we also have state income tax taken out. And you'll get back most of your federal and state. However, Social Security and Medicare you will not get back. Those go into this system. Yeah.
Sorry, what is the amount that you have to make to receive the federal and state back?
If you're filling out a 1040 EZ, this is a little off topic, then you're getting most of that back. So if you're doing your taxes, you have questions, come see me. Okay. Finally, it's a sad reality that growing up, I still knew people in rural areas without electricity. Perhaps you do too. Though today it's probably some other factors. There's been a current debate to consider public utilities a personal right. Even there's been a current debate to consider internet a public utility. But obviously we've got a long ways to go. Because the reality in the 1930s is that over half of rural families didn't have electricity in their homes. And so the Rural Electrification Administration was created to bring electricity to homes. It's also a sad reality that, as Woodrow Wilson said, that without the watchful, resolute interference of the government, there exists no fair trade between the business and the individual. What he's saying is that without rules, we all start cheating. And it's unfortunate. And what it actually does is it punishes those who are honest. So in a situation without rules, those who are honest are at a disadvantage against those who cheat and are corrupt. And so that's why pure laissez-faire economics, results in corrupt systems like our history has shown, like monopolies, like political machines, like Carnegie Halls, like some very strange, like Tammany Halls, like Roger Tammany ran New York like a fiefdom for over 20 years because of a lack of regulation. And because of a lack of regulation in public utilities, places providing electricity were charging exorbitant rates, meaning that most people could not afford simple things like electricity. So the New Deal brought opportunities to a great many groups. And in the coming slides, we'll be looking at how this affected women, and then African Americans, and then Mexican Americans, and then the labor movement. And we'll be talking about how these diverse groups came together to support the president, allowing for an overwhelming re-election in 1936. First, let's talk about women. Frances Perkins became the first female cabinet member as Secretary of Labor under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt also appointed 2 women to be foreign diplomats, 1 to be a federal judge, though the reality for most women is that they still face discrimination in the workplace from men, both men working there and managers. The National Recovery Administration set a lower minimum wage for women than that of men. So pay equity wasn't even close at this time. The federal work programs discriminated by gender, hiring far more men than that of women, and generally across the board, women experienced only a slighter percentage of wage increases.
Can you go back?
But what I guess perhaps what I want to help you understand is the irony, is that though slow progress was made, women supported the president.
I was just wondering, I thought about this, were there any small towns that because of their like local economy weren't hit as hard during the Great Depression?
Good point. So a lot of rural areas experienced the Depression somewhat differently. For example, my family owned the land they lived on, but they were so poor and lived in such a remote area, they used to joke they didn't even know there was a depression because it just was always bad. That they were subsistence farmers, meaning they were largely self-sufficient. Trips to town occurred on a rare basis, a few times a year. Otherwise, they were within their own communities. So goods traveled slowly into these parts of the country. People were without electricity. But even in these rural areas, there were programs designed to help give people work. Even in these remote areas, folks like my grandpa were able to find work with the CCC, or able to go to work for the TVA, or able to benefit from the Rural Electrification Administration. So generally this progress was experienced nationwide. But as you'll see in the coming slides, it was experienced to a lessened degree for women and minorities, though these diverse groups supported the president, which is a neat thing in itself. Next, African Americans. So Roosevelt appointed more than 100 African Americans to various government positions. His wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was an active social justice reformer. The educator Mary McLeod Bethune became head of the Division of Negro Affairs in the National Youth Administration. That was the group focused on providing jobs and education and counseling for young people. Some of the work-study programs in our country were created by the National Youth Administration. She helped to organize a, quote, black cabinet of African-American advisors to the president, on issues particularly related to minorities. Eleanor Roosevelt distinguished herself as a champion of civil rights, both for her support of African Americans in government positions, but also as a member of the Daughters of American Revolution. So, to be a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution, you have to trace direct lineage to a veteran of the war, meaning you have to have had an ancestor who fought in the Revolutionary War. Eleanor Roosevelt did. She could trace back direct lineage. I can as well. And so I could be a part of the Sons of the American Revolution. Eleanor Roosevelt withdrew her membership when they refused to allow a young black woman to play at one of their events simply because of the color of her skin. In fact, the young woman's name was Marian Anderson, and Eleanor Roosevelt withdrew her membership and arranged to have the young woman play at the Lincoln Memorial instead. Now, what we have to realize is these are cautious steps. FDR was a Democrat. The South was still voting primarily Democrat at this time. And so, had FDR taken the bold steps perhaps that he personally would have wished for, the South would have turned against him. Because, in fact, his vice president, Harry Truman, when Harry Truman took over at the end of the Second World War, and he used his executive orders to integrate the armed services, the South did turn against the Democratic Party. And they began voting Republican from that point forward to the present day. Roosevelt realized, perhaps he prioritized his goals, and he realized that strongly supporting civil rights at this time would have cost him his political career. For example, he refused to support an anti-lynching law. He refused to push for an end to the poll tax. So voting discrimination was still apparent. Lynchings were still occurring and technically legal until the 1950s. New Deal agencies discriminated by race, paying minorities lower wages and favoring whites in their hiring practices. Though with the Wagner Act and workers' protection for joining unions and collective bargaining, African American farmers were able to form a union called the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. Tenant farmer is someone who doesn't own the land they live on. They actually rent the land. And so these are, poor farmers, particularly poor farmers, but working together. Like the old Farmers Alliance slogan, united we stand, divided we fall. Working together, they were able to accomplish more. Generally, African Americans supported the New Deal, supported Roosevelt. Mexican Americans under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Mexican Americans generally supported the New Deal. Many had been coming in through the 20th century. In fact, the influx of Mexican immigrants to the United States has been growing continuously since the Mexican-American War in 1846. Most Mexican Americans coming in, especially first-generation immigrants, were working on farms in the Southwest and generally benefited little from these programs. The CCC did provide some jobs for Mexican Americans. The WPA, creating 8 million jobs, did provide some of those to Mexican Americans. However, immigrants without a permanent address were disqualified for eligibility under these work programs, which would have hindered most of these migrant workers because as seasonal workers, they would move from place to place.
If people lost their homes, how were they expected to have a permanent address?
Well, yeah, and that's especially where it hit Mexican Americans is as seasonal workers, they didn't have a permanent address. They would work for a season on a farm. And these farms that brought in migrant workers would typically have temporary residences. We have a large seasonal work population even here in this county. And many of those workers will live here temporarily and then go back somewhere else and live. I did this when I worked in the tourism industry. I would work temporarily and live on the work premise, and then I would go back to school and live there. So I technically didn't have a permanent address for about 7 years. So, I would have fallen into this distinction too. But again, the point is that it particularly affected Mexican Americans. Native Americans in the New Deal. In 1924, Native Americans for the first time received full benefits of U.S. citizenship. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Collier, changed many policies favoring autonomy. For example, the Indian Reorganization Act favored Native autonomy and mandated certain changes respecting Native American territorial rights. For example, on a tribal reservation, the land belongs to the entire tribe, not the state in which it resides. The government cannot sell unclaimed areas within the reservation. So, for example, if there is reservation land in Cherokee that is not owned by a particular individual, the government cannot designate that part of the National Forest or the Great Smoky Mountains or for public use. Yes, sir.
Does the state have no control over?
The state.
Because I know that there's something going on now where the Cherokee wants pass medical marijuana.
Yeah, the state does not have jurisdiction in Cherokee. They run their own police department. They run their own school system. We'll get to some particulars with them in just a moment. But yeah, the Cherokee school system is run by the reservation. Yeah.
Do they receive funding from the state?
They receive some federal funding by way of compensation for the land taken. I believe that Cherokee young people receive a certain amount of cash upon turning 18. I don't remember the exact amount, but that's by way of compensation for lands taken.
They still get paid for that?
Yeah, so it's a settlement because the land that was taken is the size of a state. So, what kind of price do you put on that? Yeah.
I believe there's a percentage you have to be Native American.
Yeah, you have to be a certain percentage and you have to reside on the reservation to receive that benefit. I want to say it's around $100,000. I don't know the exact number. Now, the Cherokee have several privileges that we don't. For example, they can put a casino on their property, and we'll get into that more in just a moment. But they have an autonomous government, meaning they're not technically part of the state of North Carolina. When you drive into Cherokee, you see a sign that says, "Welcome to the Cherokee Reservation." You are now under their laws. So if you speed, you are pulled over by a Cherokee police officer. I mean, they work well with North Carolina and friendly folks. I mean, I ran cross country against them all the years I coached at Rosman. Really friendly folks, yeah.
How would a ticket work? Would you have to go to their court?
You would have to go to their court. Now, the same applies if you get pulled over in Jackson County. You have to go to Jackson County's court to try your case. So, I mean, their laws are very similar to ours. There are a few distinctions, and let's go ahead and get into those. So, let's talk about the Cherokee Nation. The present government, since, of course, that's the one closest to us, but if you remember, there were many tribes affected in the Southeast by the Indian Removal Act, and Ms. Stewart taught you stuff about that. But in 1948, the present government of the Cherokee Nation was formed with the passage of the Wheeler-Howard Indian Reorganization Act, and the Eastern Band of the Cherokee was established formally at that time. So, in 1961, the Cherokee Nation was awarded $15 million by the U.S. Claims Commission for the lands of what's called the Cherokee Outlet. The story is that during the Indian Removal Act, many of the Cherokee people hid in the Smoky Mountains in some rather remote areas. If you're ever driving through that part of Western Carolina or driving past Robbinsville into Tennessee, you'll enter a community called the Snowbird Community, where they hid out in some of the rugged mountains in there. but also the eastern band of the Cherokee, the largest settlement in North Carolina. Quite a few of them hit out in the Econolophy drainage, like the Raven Fork of the Econolophy and some really remote areas in the forest there. Now, the town of Cherokee has the only casino in the state of North Carolina, and you're looking at it. It is an extremely profitable business because they basically have a government-sanctioned monopoly. Now, this is the only place you can legally gamble, aside from the one in Murphy they just built, which is also owned by the tribe.
Do you know when this picture was taken?
I just found it online.
I
So,
know they've done a ton of expanding.
I think I've been on a label like that. It looked really cool.
yeah, I mean, it looks similar. I've only been there once. I've driven by there a few times, though.
They've pretty much doubled up the size.
Okay. Yeah, and they've also expanded to Murphy. The point is that this is the only one, aside from the one in Murphy they just built, that you'll see in the state of North Carolina. So, it's the only place you can go to legally gamble in the state of North Carolina. Why? Because they're not subject to state laws. They are subject to federal law. They can't legalize murder. They can't make a law that contradicts a federal law. However, they have some rights we do not. Now, one neat thing about the tribe, the Cherokee are a communal people. They believe strongly in the sharing of resources. Every tribe member has a share in the casino. So every tribe member receives dividends from the casino, which is pretty cool. I mean, I'd love to have a share in the casino, but I don't have Cherokee in me. Yeah.
I went to New Orleans last year, and there were casinos there. Was that?
So it's a state law. There is no federal law prohibiting casinos, but the state of North Carolina has passed a state law prohibiting casinos. There are casinos, if you ever go off over to the coast of Carolina, there are floating casinos that are right off the coast. They were able to get around that law. Yeah.
Why is that? Why do you have it illegal?
It's just, I don't know. It's the law. I don't necessarily agree with the law, but it is the state law. The point is the Cherokee don't have to follow it. Okay, so the New Deal coalition is what supporters of Roosevelt called themselves. Coalition means a diverse group. And these different groups all supported the Democratic Party, particularly labor unions. The Wagner Act protected, by federal law, protected workers' rights to join unions. And if you remember last semester in U.S. History 1, we were learning about how people could get fired for joining unions. And now people are protected by federal law. You have the right to collectively bargain. And unions donated large amounts of money to FDR's campaign. Union membership also tripled during Roosevelt's administration.
In states like, I believe it is North Carolina, where the employer can fire you without a reason, could they do that as long as they aren't proven guilty of it?
Well, you could file for discrimination if they fired you and you believe or have evidence to support that you were fired for joining a union. Then yeah, you could be fired. Just like filing for discrimination on the basis of race, gender, religion, whatever. My point is that generally union members supported FDR because he was certainly showing himself as pro-labor. Prior to FDR, we see mostly craft unions, and that is skilled workers grouping together in particular unions. We don't see many full national trades unions. The Congress of Industrial Organizations distinguished themselves by organizing unions across industries and building a national labor base. Now, labor unions flourished under FDR. Some of the gains include better working conditions, such as maximum work hours. Remember when we talked about the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't uncommon for employers to require that their workers pull 16-hour days. And that's unsustainable. If you pull 16-hour days on the regular, that means you go home and go to bed. If you sleep immediately after work, you get 8 hours. Not even that, really, though. That's basically a wage slave. A 16-hour day, 6 days a week. That's terrible. But in many industries, that's what was expected to maintain employment. Yes, ma'am?
How much would you say union membership grew between 1933 and 41?
Yeah, that's okay. That was on the previous slide. It was from 3 to 10 million. So roughly tripled. But the gains were better working conditions, increased bargaining power. While individually you may not have a lot of influence, collectively you do. There were still problems, though. We saw in a clip yesterday how strike violence still occurred, how big businesses were still opposed to workers seeking better treatment, and still opposed unions. Workers organizing were still labeled communist. Sit-down strikes became one of the most important bargaining tactics of the 1930s. This is a method where people would go to their workplace and then sit down and refuse to move. And so this is almost like the sit-in strikes of the civil rights movement, where workers would go and sit down. They wouldn't hurt anybody, they wouldn't throw rocks, they wouldn't hit people, they would just physically sit down. And then the company owners would have to physically remove them by calling the police, and the police would have to come and arrest these people. And that's an important tactic. For one, the company risks embarrassing themselves by having to arrest workers en masse. And they're having to arrest people who are harming no one. It was extremely embarrassing for the government in the actions that they took against the civil rights protesters. And the same method proved effective for labor organizers. In fact, the National Labor Relations Board was able, using this tactic, to force Republic Steel, one of the largest steel producers in the country, to negotiate after a clash with strikers. But FDR won in 1936, 7 years into the Great Depression. Unemployment was still a major concern. However, he had managed to create millions of jobs. The financial industry was becoming increasingly regulated, and watchdog agencies had been implemented to prevent future corruption. And so this diverse group of urban, religious, and ethnic groups supported the president. And he was reelected.
Go back.
So the New Deal came to an end in 1937. By 1937, the improvement in the economy convinced many that the Depression was coming to an end. By this time, the Congress was cutting back many of the social programs that were creating these jobs. In fact, the New Deal was officially declared over by 1939. But as I said, it's left a controversial legacy. Your opinion on the New Deal may affect who you decide to vote for or support in this next campaign. For example, many conservatives say and point to the fact that the Great Depression did not officially end until World War II. The New Deal represented about $33 billion towards investment by way of relief, recovery, and reform. But conservatives would argue the Second World War represented about $338 billion, which compared to today's money, I mean, we're talking many trillions. So where the New Deal, lots of money, nothing in comparison to the amount of money spent on the war. And so while the New Deal did create tens of millions of jobs, it pales in comparison to the war itself. However, again, you can look at this from many different angles. Supporters generally point to the fact that even if it didn't wave a magic wand and fix the economy, it did help many people who were suffering to recover from their economic difficulties. Now let's look at a few of the lasting programs. Number one, the government's role did expand. Critics claimed that the New Deal, Roosevelt's power expanded greatly during the time of the Great Depression, and they are not wrong. Roosevelt benefited from having a legislature which was working closely with him, which was predominantly Democrat. Roosevelt benefited from being in office for almost 3 full terms, having appointed 7 Supreme Court justices. So the Supreme Court was very much in his favor as well. And so it's one of those few times where the federal government was working together. And so we came up with some lasting programs. The FDIC is one of these very important ones, continues to regulate the banking industry today. Your individual bank accounts are insured up to $250,000 by the federal government. And so this was created to instill confidence in the banking system. I don't worry about whether my bank will collapse because I know my account is insured. I have no reason to take my money out of the bank, nor do most Americans. The Securities and Exchange Commission continues to regulate and monitor the stock market, looking for unfair or illegal practices. As I said, the New Deal did not magically end the Great Depression. However, the relief programs do help with suffering people. The jobs programs do provide money for people to earn. And it does give hope to many. Think of the hopelessness of the despair of being able and willing to work and provide for yourself and your family, but being unable to find work. However, the federal government did go deeply into debt from this deficit spending to create jobs and provide aid. But nowhere near the amount of debt that the federal government incurred on the massive spending on equipment and supplies for World War II, which, yes, did officially end the Great Depression. But think about it this way. If we were borrowing money to spend $33 billion, how much money were we borrowing to spend $338 billion? So again, both represent deficit spending. So many of the enduring reform laws still protect us today, such as laws setting standards on labor, like the Fair Labor Standards Act, laws banning child labor, which is why you can't get an official job until you're 16. There are a few exceptions, and I realize that, hardship exemption, so forth. But generally 16 is the year where you may begin working. The National Labor Relations Board still mediates labor disputes today. Banking and finance are still regulated through the SEC and the FDIC. Laws are enforced. However, an issue in this election is to what degree are these laws enforced, and are they still capable of monitoring the banking and financial sector in our country today? And so that question still remains. Some of the laws have been allowed to expire during the 1990s in a period known as banking deregulation. Some of the laws were changed or removed entirely, such as Glass-Steagall. And this conversation continues today. of what should be done about the banking and financial sector. The question, are some banks too big to fail, is one that candidates continue to ask today. Social Security continues to be a lasting safety net. It was the first federal safety net of its kind. Safety net meaning that if you find yourself unable to work through old age or disability, you may qualify for help. This was the first of its kind. As you begin working, you will all pay into it with the expectation that it will continue to be around today. The solvency of Social Security continues to be a matter of debate. Even if you live in a very rural area, such as we do, even if you live in an agrarian area, such as we do with our apple farms and our agrarian economy in Henderson County, the Commodity Credit Corporation has benefited those of us whose livelihoods are attached to farming, which, by the way, is all of us because we have to eat. The Commodity Credit Corporation makes loans to farmers based on the amount of farmers' surplus called parity price, meaning that the price of the loan is based on the income of the farmer. Agricultural price supports also set a precedent of federal aid to farmers. Farm subsidies are part of why farmers are able to make a living, even in difficult times. And food costs, though they don't always feel this way, are able to remain low. So parity means that the price is intended to keep the farmer's income steady. This is a form of debt repayment. It's also called income adjusted debt repayment. I was talking to Coach Frady about his student loans. They are based on the amount of money he takes in each month. The student loans subtract a small part of that from his check each month. If for some reason he makes less each month, it's a parity price, meaning it's adjusted based on his income. The New Deal had a lot to do with the environment as well. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted trees, built hiking trails, built fire lookout towers all throughout this area. The Soil Conservation Service continues to teach farmers methods for how to preserve soil. The CCC was involved in building a number of these roads around here. You can look up and find pictures of FDR cutting the ribbon on the Blue Ridge Parkway. The Taylor Grazing Act was created to stop farmers from grazing cattle on public lands. I don't know if you heard about the recent drama from the farmers in Oregon that had seized a federal wildlife refuge. So if you heard about that, it was just resolved yesterday. They finally surrendered. They took over the compound on New Year's Eve, and they just gave up and surrendered to the authorities. One of them was killed in a shootout a few weeks ago. The rest surrendered peacefully and are now facing felony charges. The reason they claim for taking over this federal wildlife compound was that they had been brought up on charges under the Taylor Grazing Act. They had been grazing their cattle on public lands. The federal government fined them for this, and they claimed those lands were their ancestral homeland. They were also shooting animals on these public lands. They were poaching wildlife, and they were brought up on charges. And instead of facing the charges, they decided to take over this compound.
Wasn't also one thing, so I remember hearing about that they were grazing on federal land.
Yeah, that's what I mean by public land. So well, it was federal land, and they were grazing cattle on that land, which is a crime under the Taylor Grazing Act. And They didn't, one of their members went to jail for it, and then they decided to take matters into their own hands. Anyway, you can read about it more later. The Tennessee Valley Authority created many of the lakes around here. Kiowa, Jocassee, many of the hydroelectric dams were created by the Tennessee Valley Authority. Many of them date back to the 1930s. The government added national parks. The Great Smoky Mountains was added during the 1930s under the New Deal. Wildlife refuges, wilderness areas. Joyce Kilmer is one of the largest wilderness areas, containing one of the only tracts of unlogged timber in the southeastern United States. It's outside of Robbinsville, so go see the Joyce Kilmer Slick Rock Wilderness. Many of these wilderness areas were designated in the 1930s. The closest wilderness area to us is Shining Rock Wilderness. Wilderness areas are a special place. National Forest contains roads. You can camp most anywhere. Rules and regulations are rather slack. Wilderness areas are very strict. You cannot have any roads. You cannot have any trail signs. It can sometimes be difficult to navigate. It's easy to get lost in these areas because the rules are that these areas must remain as they are and be allowed to become wild once more. So explore them sometime. It's beautiful country, about as untouched a wilderness as you can find in our area, and many of them were created by the New Deal. But not everything was good for the environment. The New Deal funds did provide subsidies and funding for strip mining, for coal burning, and of course these things cause pollution. At this time, energy production was largely dependent on coal and mining. Obviously not too good for the environment.